Close your eyes and imagine Britain in the 1960s and 70s. The Beatles are on the radio, children play freely in the streets until the streetlights come on, and every household echoes with phrases that would make modern parents raise their eyebrows. These were the decades that shaped a generation, a time when childhood was vastly different from today, and the language parents used reflected the values, humor, and sometimes the harshness of the era. The sayings we heard as children stay with us forever. They become part of our internal voice, shaping how we think, how we parent, and how we see the world. For those who grew up in Britain during the 60s and 70s, certain phrases were universal, heard in homes from Cornwall to Scotland, whispered in playgrounds and shouted from kitchen doorways. Today, we're taking a nostalgic journey back to those formative years, exploring 15 British sayings that were on every parent's lips and in every child's memory. Some will make you smile with recognition, others might make you wince, but all of them tell the story of a generation and the unique British childhood experience that defined an era. These weren't just words. They were the soundtrack to growing up British in a time of social change, economic challenges, and cultural revolution. Wait till your father gets home. This phrase struck fear into the hearts of children across Britain. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise of impending judgment. In the 60s and 70s, traditional family structures meant dad was often the disciplinarian, the final authority figure whose word was law. Mothers would use this phrase throughout the day to defer serious misbehavior to the evening reckoning. The power of this saying lay in the anticipation. Children would spend hours worrying about what would happen when Dad walked through that door after work. Would there be a stern talking to? Would privileges be revoked? The phrase reflected the gender roles of the time, where fathers were seen as the enforcers while mothers managed the day-to-day operations of child-rearing. It also speaks to a time when corporal punishment was not only legal but expected, and the threat of paternal discipline was a significant deterrent. I'll give you something to cry about. This phrase sends shivers down the spines of anyone who heard it as a child. It was the ultimate paradox, a threat made in response to crying that promised to give you an even better reason to cry. The logic was circular and undeniable, and it usually made children swallow their tears immediately. This saying reflects a very different attitude toward children's emotions than we see today. In the 60s and 70s, the prevailing belief was that children needed to be toughened up, that excessive sensitivity was something to be corrected rather than validated. Emotional expression, especially from boys, was often discouraged with phrases like this. The stiff upper lip mentality that characterized British culture for centuries was still very much alive and being passed down to the next generation. While modern parenting emphasizes emotional intelligence and validation of feelings, this phrase shows how different the approach was just a few decades ago. Children should be seen and not heard. This Victorian-era phrase was still going strong in the 60s and 70s, particularly in more traditional households. It encapsulated the belief that children occupied a specific place in the social hierarchy, and that place was below adults. When adults were talking, children were expected to remain silent, no matter how boring or long the conversation dragged on. This saying was particularly enforced during family gatherings, visits from relatives, or when guests came to the house. Children were expected to be presentable, polite, and above all, quiet. They could be displayed when needed, showing off good manners or a new skill, but their opinions, thoughts, and feelings were not considered important enough to interrupt adult conversation. This reflects a more formal, hierarchical view of family life that has largely disappeared from modern British culture, where children's voices are now encouraged and valued. Waste not, want not. This phrase was drummed into children at every meal. In the 60s and 70s, Britain was still recovering from the austerity of the post-war years. Many parents had lived through rationing, and the habits of frugality died hard. Food waste was seen not just as careless but as morally wrong, a sin against those who had less. Children were expected to clean their plates completely, regardless of whether they liked what was served or how full they were. The phrase reinforced values of gratitude, resourcefulness, and respect for what you had. If you wasted food, you'd want for food later, the logic went. It was both practical wisdom and a reflection of economic anxiety. Many families in the 60s and 70s were working class or lower middle class, living paycheck to paycheck, and every penny and every scrap of food mattered. There are children starving in Africa. This was the guilt trip that accompanied every refused meal. If you didn't want to eat your overcooked Brussels sprouts or congealed liver, you'd be reminded of children in Africa who would be grateful for such food. The phrase was meant to instill gratitude and perspective, though its effectiveness was questionable. Children would sometimes respond with childish logic, asking how their eating food in Britain would help children in Africa, which usually didn't go over well. This saying reflects the paternalistic attitudes of the era toward developing nations, as well as the charitable impulses that were emerging in British society. Organizations like Oxfam were growing, and awareness of global poverty was increasing, though the understanding was often simplistic. The phrase also shows how guilt was used as a parenting tool, attempting to shame children into compliance by invoking the suffering of others. Your eyes are bigger than your belly. This phrase was directed at children who filled their plates with more food than they could possibly eat. It was both an observation and a mild rebuke, suggesting that greed or ambition had overcome common sense. The saying was usually followed by the command to finish everything on the plate, reinforcing the waste not, want not mentality. The phrase is wonderfully visual and very British in its indirect way of calling someone greedy. Rather than directly saying you've taken too much, it frames the problem as a disconnect between desire and capacity. It taught children to be more realistic about their appetites and more considerate about not wasting food. In an era when second helpings might not be available because there simply wasn't enough food, taking more than you could eat was not just wasteful but inconsiderate to others who might go hungry. Money doesn't grow on trees. Every British child who ever asked for a toy, sweets, or anything that cost money heard this phrase. It was the universal response to requests for purchases, a reminder that money was a limited resource that had to be earned through hard work. The metaphor was clear: money doesn't appear magically and abundantly like leaves on a tree. It must be worked for. This saying reflects the economic realities of the 60s and 70s when many families struggled to make ends meet. The 3-day week, strikes, inflation, and economic instability meant that money genuinely was tight in many households. The phrase taught children to understand the value of money, to appreciate what they had, and to think twice before asking for things. It was part of a broader education in economic reality that children received much earlier than they often do today. I'm not made of money. This was the personal version of money doesn't grow on trees, a declaration from parents that their financial resources had limits. It usually came after repeated requests for purchases or when children assumed parents could afford anything. The phrase expressed frustration and set boundaries around what was financially possible. In the 60s and 70s, consumer culture was growing, advertising was becoming more sophisticated, and children were being targeted as consumers in new ways. Toys, games, sweets, and clothes were all being marketed directly to children through television and magazines. This created new pressures on parents, and phrases like this were defensive responses to these commercial pressures. The saying taught children that desires must be balanced against resources and that parents, despite what children might think, have financial constraints. A fool and his money are soon parted. This proverb was used to teach children about financial wisdom and the dangers of impulsive spending. If a child wanted to spend all their pocket money on sweets or a toy that would break immediately, they'd hear this warning. The phrase suggested that stupidity and money don't mix, and that financial success requires intelligence and restraint. The saying reflects a value system that prized thrift, planning, and careful decision-making. In working-class and middle-class British culture of the 60s and 70s, these were survival skills, not abstract virtues. Poor financial decisions could have serious consequences for families living close to the edge. By teaching children this phrase early, parents hope to instill habits that would serve them throughout life, helping them avoid the poverty trap that claimed many who made poor financial choices. Go outside and play, you're not staying cooped up inside. This phrase was heard in households across Britain, especially during school holidays and weekends. In the 60s and 70s, childhood was spent largely outdoors. There was no internet, no smartphones, no gaming consoles to speak of, and television programming was limited. Parents actively encouraged, even insisted, that children go outside. This saying reflects a very different childhood experience than today. Children would leave their homes in the morning and not return until tea time, or when the streetlights came on. They'd play in streets, parks, woods, and waste ground, creating their own games and adventures with minimal adult supervision. This free-range childhood is now largely extinct, replaced by scheduled activities and constant parental oversight. The phrase shows that parents then believed fresh air and physical activity were essential for healthy development, and that boredom inside the house was simply not acceptable. You'll catch your death of cold. This warning was issued whenever children went outside without proper clothing, particularly without a coat, hat, or scarf. British parents were convinced that cold weather directly caused illness, and that being improperly dressed was dangerous. The phrase was usually accompanied by forced bundling up before being allowed outside. The belief that cold causes colds is actually a misconception. Viruses cause colds, not temperature. However, this didn't stop British parents from being obsessed with keeping children warm and dry. The phrase reflects both genuine concern for children's health and perhaps also the harsh economic reality that illness meant lost work time for parents and potential medical expenses. It also shows the British preoccupation with weather, which remains a national characteristic. The phrase was part of a broader anxiety about health in an era when the National Health Service was still relatively new and families remembered times when medical care was expensive and dangerous illnesses were more common. Mind your PS and QS. This phrase was a reminder to be polite and watch your behavior, particularly in social situations or when meeting adults. The origins of the phrase are disputed, but in the 60s and 70s, it was universally understood to mean be on your best behavior and remember your manners. Please and thank you, the PS and QS, were non-negotiable requirements. Politeness was deeply valued in British culture, perhaps more so than in many other countries. Children were expected to say please when asking for something, thank you when receiving it, to address adults as Mr., Mrs., or Miss with the surname, and to generally show respect through language and demeanor. This phrase was often said before visiting relatives, going to a friend's house, or any situation where the child would be representing the family. Poor manners reflected badly not just on the child but on the parents and the entire family, creating strong social pressure to conform to behavioral expectations. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. This was the British version of the American saying popularized by Thumper and Bambi, though it existed in British culture long before the film. It was a command to avoid gossip, insults, and unkind comments, teaching children that silence was preferable to cruelty. The phrase reflects the British cultural emphasis on politeness, discretion, and emotional restraint. Open conflict, direct insults, and frank expressions of dislike were considered vulgar and low class. Children were taught to keep negative opinions to themselves, to be diplomatic, and to maintain social harmony even if it meant suppressing their true feelings. This created the foundation for the famous British passive-aggressiveness and indirect communication style that characterizes much social interaction. While the intention was to create kindness and prevent hurt feelings, critics might argue it also taught children to be inauthentic and to suppress legitimate feelings and concerns. Many hands make light work. This proverb was used to recruit children into household chores and family projects. It taught that working together makes difficult tasks easier and faster. If there was cleaning to be done, gardening, or any labor-intensive task, this phrase would be trotted out to encourage participation and cooperation. In the 60s and 70s, children were expected to contribute to the household from a young age. There were no dishwashers in most homes, no convenience foods to speak of, and household management was genuinely labor-intensive. Children would help with washing up, cleaning, shopping, gardening, and caring for younger siblings. This saying promoted the value of collective effort and taught children that they were part of a family unit that survived through cooperation. It also subtly communicated that complaining about chores was pointless because everyone had to pitch in. If a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. This phrase was used to combat sloppy work and half-hearted effort. If a child rushed through their chores or homework, doing the minimum to technically complete the task, they'd hear this saying and be sent back to do it properly. It taught standards of excellence and pride in workmanship. The saying reflects working class and middle class values around labor and craftsmanship. In a society where many people worked in manufacturing, trades, or service industries, the quality of your work was directly tied to your reputation and employment security. Doing things properly, taking pride in your work, and maintaining high standards were seen as moral virtues as well as practical necessities. Parents hoped to instill these values in children so they would grow into reliable, respected workers. The phrase also taught that shortcuts and laziness would ultimately create more work because poorly done tasks would have to be redone. Life's not fair, get used to it. This brutally honest phrase was the response to children's complaints about injustice, inequality, or unfavorable outcomes. Whether it was about a sibling getting something they didn't, a teacher being mean, or just bad luck, parents would shut down the complaint with this reality check. It wasn't sympathetic, but it was honest. The phrase reflects a pragmatic, somewhat fatalistic worldview that was common in British working-class culture. Life was hard, resources were limited, and expecting fairness was naive. The saying taught children to be resilient, to accept disappointment without complaint, and to understand that the world didn't owe them anything. While modern parenting often focuses on building self-esteem and validating feelings, this approach emphasized toughness and realistic expectations. It prepared children for a world where meritocracy was imperfect, where unfairness was common, and where complaining achieved nothing. The phrase has fallen out of favor as attitudes toward childhood have changed, but those who heard it learned to be resilient and to fight their own battles without expecting intervention. These 15 sayings were more than just words. They were the tools British parents used to shape their children's character, values, and worldview during the transformative decades of the 1960s and 70s. Each phrase carried layers of meaning, reflecting the economic realities, social values, and cultural attitudes of the era. Some of these sayings now seem harsh or outdated. Modern parenting emphasizes emotional validation, positive reinforcement, and nurturing rather than the tough love approach these phrases often represented. We understand now that children's emotions deserve respect, that authoritarian parenting has drawbacks, and that some traditional attitudes were limiting or even harmful. Yet there's also wisdom in many of these sayings. The emphasis on gratitude, on not wasting resources, on working hard, on being polite, on being resilient, these remain valuable lessons. The children who grew up hearing these phrases learned to be tough, resourceful, and independent. They didn't need constant entertainment or supervision. They understood that life involves disappointment, and that complaining achieves nothing. They learned to contribute to their families and communities. For those who grew up in Britain during the 60s and 70s, these sayings are deeply embedded in memory. Hearing them again brings back a flood of images, smells of home cooking, the sound of parents' voices, the feeling of being a child in a world that was simpler in some ways and harsher in others. These phrases connect us to our past, to our parents and grandparents, and to a way of life that has largely disappeared. Language shapes us. The words we hear as children become our internal dialogue, influencing how we parent our own children, how we face challenges, and how we understand the world. These British sayings from the 60s and 70s shaped a generation, and their echoes continue to resonate in the lives of those who heard them. As we move further from that era, it's valuable to remember these sayings, to understand the context that produced them, and to recognize both their wisdom and their limitations. They're a window into a different Britain, a different childhood, and a different way of thinking about family, responsibility, and growing up. Whether we choose to pass them on to new generations or consciously leave them in the past, they remain an important part of British cultural history and the collective memory of millions who heard them during their formative years. The Britain of the 60s and 70s has vanished, transformed by technology, economic change, and evolving social attitudes. But the children who grew up then, shaped by these sayings and the values they represented, are still here, carrying those lessons forward into a very different world.